This is When I Grow Up with Paul Glazby.
Michael,
Paul,
welcome back.
thanks for having me.
No problem. Always a pleasure.
I'm sure it is.
So, obviously, your second visit back to the When I Grow Up podcast.
Yeah.
This one's going to be a little bit different. This is going to be the first of hopefully many more real estate specific ones. And I can't think of anyone better in real estate to speak to than you.
That's a lovely compliment, mate.
So, Michael, you've been an auctioneer for nearly 40 years.
Indeed.
Hard to believe.
And you wouldn't think so by looking at me, but yes.
Why would someone auction their property?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good question. And I think that I think a lot of people that are thinking of selling probably are provided a number of different sales strategies from the various agents that they might talk to. I think, but as an auctioneer, my thought process behind this is relatively simple. I think it comes down to sort of the laws of supply and demand. I think when you're in a seller's market, i.e. there's not a lot of property available for sale, but there's plenty of buyers, the likelihood of you having competition on your property and more than one person wanting to buy it is pretty solid. So I guess the first thing is we look at market conditions. And if we get a tick against that box, in other words, there's most likely going to be more than one person wanting to buy that property. That would be an indicator to potentially start thinking about going to auction, but it's not the only thing that we would consider. I think the second thing we consider is the property type. I think most things that go under the hammer, regardless of whether they're a property or not, particularly if you consider paintings or antiques or anything that has a certain level of uniqueness about it, I think is an indicator of people's desirability for something. And I think if we have a very desirable property, that provides you with another tick. So, what does desirability mean? Well, I guess properties that are not often available in a particular location, one comes up and everybody's going to want to buy it. So I think looking at the property type, that can go the other way as well. Not to say that properties all have a lot of negative things about them, but if you backed onto a tip, for example, or a garbage disposal facility, you're going to really thin out your market. So for us, we look at the property type and whether there's anything objectionable about the property that's going to detour people from wanting to participate in the process of trying to purchase. So if we get a tick to the market and we get a tick to the property, I think the final box that needs to be ticked, and this is probably the most important, Paul, and I think you know that, having dealt with people through this process, is the client themselves. For a lot of people, it's a pretty scary prospect going down the path of an auction, and they often feel very much out of control. I think they feel that by giving a property to an agent to then employ an auctioneer to sell that property is taking their control over the sale away from them, which is so far from the truth. It's not funny. In fact, I think that if any method gives an owner complete control, it is a sale by auction. A reserve price is really the owner's line in the sand, i.e. below that we're not selling. So people do have fears and they do have phobias and they've had past bad experiences, and auctions, if you've had a bad auction, you're not likely to want to do it again. But then perhaps you've had a bad auctioneer. It's a little bit like, if you had a bad Chinese meal, does that mean you don't go out eating Chinese ever again? No, you put it down to a bad meal. So
it might not even be the auctioneer. It could be the sales agents that have been running the campaign up to the point of auction.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, it's the sales agent's role to manage that auction campaign that will determine whether it's a successful outcome or not. And to be honest, as a fee auctioneer, I can tell you, having called literally close to maybe 4.5, maybe more thousand residential auctions, and having been a fee auctioneer, that it is more often than not a salesperson not knowing what they're doing in terms of handling the campaign that actually ends up with a failed auction. So regardless of how good you are as an auctioneer, if the campaign has been mishandled, you're likely to have a failed auction. And for most people, a failed auction can be pretty devastating. They pin their hopes on the day, and when it doesn't work, it's pretty disappointing. And that's not to say that I sell everything that we auction by any stretch of the imagination, but we certainly want to put in place the processes and strategies that are going to make sure that that an owner is given every opportunity to get a great result on the day. And further to that, if somebody were to say, why else should we auction if those three things have been met, I think it's because it gives an owner the opportunity to get the very best and strongest form of contract available, i.e., in most cases when a property is sold under normal sale conditions, there are certain contingencies that often the contracts require. One of those will be usually a finance condition. Another one is a building and or pest inspection, and the laws are pretty loosely written in the sense that a purchaser simply just has to be unsatisfied with their building and pest or unsatisfied with their finance application, and they can terminate the contract. And for a lot of people...
That's here in Queensland, though.
That's here in Queensland. In other states, in the southern states, and as you know, we have a Melbourne branch as well, or a Melbourne office, and the laws are a little tighter. But again,
there's always a get out. Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to sell your property, and for a lot of people, there's quite an expense. Staging of a property, advertising, just generally preparing your home for sale, going through,
and the emotional expense as well.
Yeah, totally. It's a huge thing for an owner to sell a property, and I think that a lot of salespeople, a lot of agents don't really quite understand the sorts of pressure that people are under when they're selling a property. It is a huge emotional thing. So I think to have a contract that is fairly, locked tight for an owner is important, because it simply means that when they sign on the dotted line, their property is sold and they can then, start really planning the next move.
Lack of contingencies, so we just covered that.
Yeah, so that certainly gives it a fair amount of appeal to a seller. The fact that you're selling on an unconditional cash basis, so that there are no contingencies to be met. Yep. You're not going to be disappointed 7 or 14 days, down the track when the purchaser is unable to achieve finance for the property, because it means a buyer has to do that sort of due diligence prior to signing a contract. And I think the big advantage to selling a property without a building and pest inspection is that all parties are very clear as to what they're negotiating for and what they're buying. I often feel a little aggrieved when people simply use a building and pest inspection to try to use that as a means of leverage against a seller, to perhaps renegotiate the price, even if they're just quite minor things. The ability to simply walk away from a contract based on a whim, in my opinion, leaves an owner quite vulnerable. So I think that the idea of going to auction just provides a little bit more security for the owner's point of view. And it equally doesn't mean that a purchaser shouldn't be or is not entitled to a building and pest inspection. In fact, in the majority of cases, as you would well know, we would provide, or not us, but the owners would typically provide a building and pest inspection report available prior to the auction, so that a purchaser can bid with complete and full confidence. And I think that's an important thing.
Yep. A couple of things I wanted to mention as well, which a lot of people probably don't factor in, is your ability to sell prior to auction.
Yep.
And also, if you don't sell under the hammer, that's not necessarily a failed auction. You've got to look at that sort of 10 to 14 days after the auction performance, because obviously at the point where it doesn't sell at auction, you may, as we've done in the past, negotiate with the highest bidder and get it sold within 10 to 15 minutes after the auction finished, or all of a sudden all those buyers that weren't able to perform at auction because of needing finance, for example, they can then step into the picture, and oftentimes they will make an offer potentially higher than
what may have been achieved at the auction.
Exactly,
Yeah,
but then you do then have the risk of the finance. But at that stage,
well,
at
least you've explored the option. And,
exactly.
and look, not everybody's in a position to be able to buy a cash unconditional property. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have finance in place that's required, but it means they've sort of done their homework and they've got their pre-approvals in place and they're fairly confident of having a loan approved on a property. I don't think as real estate agents or auctioneers you really want anyone to enter into a contract that they are not going to be comfortably able to complete. So the idea of sort of not wanting people to have conditions of finance and steering people away from that, I think is wrong. But I think if you're offering a property up for auction, we're calling for that type of contract. So to an extent, we are eliminating a portion of the market. But if there's enough people and the market, again, is buoyant enough and the property is desirable enough, then there's odds on that there will be more than one person that's going to want to buy that property. And if they're competing at a cash unconditional level, well, then often the best price can be achieved. For some owners too, it's the idea of having a finite date that they're working towards. Some people list a property for sale, and the idea of it being for sale for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks on end, and open house after open house after open house, and keeping the home tidy, particularly when you're juggling kids, as you and I have both done throughout our lives, it's a lot. And on top of that, you got work. So I think to encapsulate the sale period to a 3 or 4 week period, I think is good for an owner's mental health, and I think it's good for buyers, and particularly here in Queensland on the Gold Coast, a lot of our settlements are 30 days, meaning that somebody buys a house, they're going to need to move into it within 30 days, pretty much. So it moves pretty rapidly and pretty quickly. So I think you're right in the sense that there are 3 really good opportunities to sell with an auction, and that is before, at, or after. For a lot of people, for some reason, the concept of a property not selling at auction represents failure. It's far from the truth. We've had many owners that we've recommended that they don't accept the offer that's being presented to them on the day of auction, simply because we know we can get more for the property than what's currently being offered. Yeah. And if you're doing your fiduciary duty as a real estate agent, well, then you're going to make that recommendation to your owner. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. Some people are really fearful of auctions, and I think to make sure that older people, for example, to them they feel that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the day, and there really should be zero pressure, as the way we handle things. But I think for those people, why would you, the market's good, the house is right, but the owners are not right for an auction, then I think as an auctioneer and as a real estate agent, I think it's your duty to not lead somebody down a path that's going to cause them any level of distress. It's distressing enough as it is. So,
Fears, frustrations, and funnies. So this is a section that we're going to do where we discuss little idiosyncrasies, would that be the right word?
Nuances. Things that we deal with every single day.
Things that we deal with every day that we come across from buyers and sellers in real estate. This week, we're going to do fears, and it is around buyers when they make an offer, worried that their offer is just going to be taken by that agent and then banded around to all the other buyers to see if they can beat that offer.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty rational fear for many buyers to have, to be honest with you. I mean, I've purchased homes, you've purchased homes. When you make an offer to try to buy a property, you sort of instinctively feel as though that offer will be delivered to the owner for their consideration. But to fear that an agent will take your offer before they even communicate your offer to the owner to see whether they might be able to slightly better the offer and then more importantly that they disclose that offer. I think agents have a duty. Well, I don't even think we do. We have a fiduciary duty for our seller. We are charged with the responsibility of getting the absolute best price we can for our seller. That doesn't mean that a buyer should be disadvantaged in the way that they're dealt with and their approach to buying a property. So I think firstly, buyers when they're dealing with agents, I think agents should be upfront about how do you deal with a multiple offer situation. I think it's often not knowing what's in front of them that causes the sorts of fears in regards to that sort of multi-offer situation. I know in our office, for example, we would simply not sell any property without giving every interested party the opportunity of participating in the offer submission process. But at the same time, we're certainly not going to take one person's offer and then simply spray it around to the rest of the market to see if somebody is prepared to better it by $500 or $1,000. We do have a duty to let other buyers know of an offer, and particularly if that's at an acceptable level. But we shouldn't be disclosing any of the details of that offer. I think the Privacy Act really, to some extent, should cover that anyway. But I think for a lot of buyers, I think that there's a huge fear around, if I make an offer, are you going to take it to the owner and when are you going to give me a response to this? And often you'll find that the only sort of remedy that a buyer has under those circumstances is to put a deadline on their offer. And, you and I have both had that occur in our business, in our real estate lives. And And it comes from a reasonable position where buyers are like, well, I don't want my offer sitting there while you race off to see if you can get somebody else to pay $1,000 more. But I think if you were to explain how you're going to handle a multiple offer situation to the buyer when they're making an offer, so that they have a full understanding of how it works. I think more often than not, it's not being informed that is the big problem. So, we go to quite large lengths, and I think any really good real estate agent is either doing this or should be doing this. But it doesn't mean it happens all the time. And you and I both know that we've had, plenty of people that have, purchased a property through our business, and, they'll talk, pretty poorly about the previous agent that they were trying to buy a property through because they'd made an offer and then they weren't even told that there was another offer. They just got, a call back or a text message.
Yeah, they follow it up they make the offer on a Monday, they follow up on a Wednesday, and they say, oh no, I've sold that one.
Yeah, to someone else. Yeah. And they sit there and so this is what I mean. I think it's quite understandable that buyers are going to be aggrieved by a lot of the behaviours and practices of real estate agents. And so those fears are sometimes very much founded in bad estate agency practice. Yeah. And it really starts at the very top. The directors of the business should be directing the business. They should be imparting on their staff how multiple offers are to be handled. It should be a very open and transparent way, and buyers should know about that before they participate in making offers. Yeah. So I think it's a valid fear, and it's a fear that I think can be really overcome with good communication, like most things. Yeah. Okay, Paul, this segment, Real Talk. Real people, real stories, of which we have plenty occurring literally
daily
on a multiple basis. What's one that immediately springs to mind, and particularly from something that might be quite recent in your mind?
Well, actually, this one is from this week, fresh in my mind. And I wanted to talk about this because obviously in real estate, a lot of people think that, every real estate is just money grabbing, low life or
thieves.
Yeah. Which, I'm sure some are, just like some.
Every profession.
Every profession, yeah.
Let's be
whether
honest.
you're a plumber or a whatever.
There's good and bad.
There's good and bad in
absolutely
everything.
Every
That's
profession.
right. So it's not a completely unfounded thing for people to think that. And at the end of the day, I feed my children by selling houses. So I don't take any sort of. I'm not ashamed of the fact that we make money from selling houses. I mean, that's just what we do. But we get that money because we deliver we do the right thing. We deliver a service that should enhance people's lives, both the buyer and the seller. And this week, I realised that so I made a sale, and the couple, beautiful people, I'd actually sold a property for I sold a property to their niece. So I'd met the lady. The very first inspection that a niece came to, a different property to what she actually bought, but I met her there, and then I bumped into her a couple of times, just around because she lives local. And anyway, just completely out of the blue, I get a call a few weeks ago, and she said, "Look, we're heading back to Sydney." Her husband, who I'd not met at the time, he was having some health issues, and they had to go back to Sydney. And can you come out and see us? Now, obviously, every time I go to see someone about selling the house, you're always assuming that you're up against other agents, other people. You never want to just assume you've got control over the situation. And in the list, so I met them and got on really well with them. He's lovely as well. And there was I can't remember what it was. There's something I said during the listing appointment. I referenced something about other agents or something, and he's kind of stopped me. He said, "Mate, we're not talking to anybody else." He said,
Yep.
"Claire, trust you. Bridget, trust your niece. Trust you." He said, "So that's good enough for me." He said, we're selling through you. I'm like, okay, fantastic. But then the pressure you've then got because someone's so, invested in and trusts you that it increases the pressure, not reduces it. But which is a good thing, I think.
But it's also a great privilege for an owner to choose you unopposed from other agents, because it then is a real reflection on the type of person you are, that you have that relationship with them, and I think something that it's then a responsibility that is quite huge.
Yeah.
as you no doubt felt.
Yes. So anyway, we launched the campaign, got the photography done, everything's beautiful, did the open homes, getting good numbers through. But they were very anxious. You know, they were thinking that things weren't going to,
Go so smoothly.
Yeah. And they'd found a place in Sydney. They committed to that, so they kind of put themselves in a situation where they had to sell.
Yeah.
And anyway, we get into the last week of the campaign. Because of how we'd managed the campaign and with the buyers, I could sense that there was just, there was a couple of people that seemed to be head and shoulders above the rest of the market, which, as we spoke about in the auction section, for a successful auction, you want as many people. You can't just have one person. Yeah. If you've got two, maybe it can work, but you really want 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,
and in some
23, 23 bidders. So I didn't get the sense that we were, in that situation. So I kind of pushed the people to see where we could get to, having had a conversation. So I went around to see them during the week just to sort of let them know how things were going. And I didn't realise until I was sort of sat with them how sort of well-timed that meeting was, because they were real on edge by then. And they sent me a message afterwards saying, thanks so much for coming around. We feel a lot better after having the conversation. But I got a sense of where they were feeling that the price would end up on auction day.
Yeah.
And then I ended up getting the sort of two main people that were, I thought were the main buyers. Spoke to those guys, managed to get signed contracts, went to see them. And the whole point of this story is when I actually sat with them and presented the contract, I said, look, guys, what would be good news? What would be bad news? And they kind of gave me their, good news outcome.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, well, what about this? And slid it across to them. It was,
and obviously more than what they're good.
A hell of a lot more than
what
they just told me. Yeah. So a bit of a risk, because they'd said more, and then what about this? But so I slid it across. Said, what about that? And she starts crying, tears of joy. He looked pretty emotional as well. All the coming around and giving me a hug. And I just thought, this is what real estate's about. This is Absolutely what it is for me. The I can't remember the exact saying, but it's like, if you help enough people get what they want, then you'll have all the money you need. And that's really how real estate works. But those moments where...
It sort of keeps you in the game.
Yeah.
It's like when you play golf, you might have a whole bunch of bad hits, but you only need one good one, and you'll be back playing again. Yeah. And that's the same with real estate. I mean, it's those moments where you're with a seller in the way that you were, and there's that level of appreciation. Because you're up close and personal to people. I mean, you're in their homes and they're sharing really private information with you, in some cases really sad and tragic circumstances where we're often acting on behalf of people. Other times it's a joyous occasion. But under most circumstances, I think most owners are feeling the way they would have been feeling halfway through that campaign. A level of anxiousness, nervousness, and, you obviously, kicked a goal for them to the point where you made them both cry.
Yeah. All about making the women cry. Story of my life.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that, that you get that level of appreciation. And I've seen already a little video they did for you.
Yeah. Which they're literally like one of my sort of favourite campaigns. Like everything just went, as well as it
and you would get some agents potentially would just want to call the auction for the sake of calling the auction, as opposed to doing what is right for the owner. And there is no doubt that from that owner's perspective, that was most definitely the best possible outcome for them, and it would have been the wrong thing to run that property through to auction. Not because we didn't have other bidders on the property, we did, but I think that these people clearly really loved the home. And I think interestingly that you'd mentioned to me that the owner, the gentleman, had said to you right at the very beginning, because if I'm not mistaken, one of the buyers the buyer that bought the property came through the very first open house. Is that correct? And he'd made a comment that
she'll be the buyer.
Yeah,
he picked it. I don't know. He's like some savant or something.
Yeah. So and what you want is exactly what you got with that. You've got a really ecstatic and happy seller. That in fairly trying times where they're dealing with some health issues, you've been able to alleviate that to an exceptional level. I mean, you know, that property is sold, deposits are paid, it'll settle, they can plan and move, and that's really why.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the
Yeah.
auction, selling prior to auction. You know,
Totally.
sometimes they don't make it all the way.
Yeah, yeah.
And you get
I mean, if the best situation is for the owner, and, you know, owners know what's best for them. All we need to do is deliver the best outcome that we can, and whether that's before an auction, at an auction, or after an auction, the owners know what's in their better interests, and we should be just simply following that. But yeah, that was a great outcome, and I think your buyer's equally as happy. I think
sure,
you mentioned earlier that it goes both ways.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want people feeling that they've been misled, lied to, or, you know, played in any way or capacity. And I think you know, the idea of a win-win is how it should be on every deal.
Yeah. Real talk,
Real people,
real stories.
real estate.
Till next time, Michael. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's been great. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.
This is When I Grow Up with Paul Glazby.